So hello everybody, under my last video about ConvertWithMoss someone asked about support for the Ensoniq series samplers, and yeah, it was already on my list but pretty low, and nevertheless I somehow got interested in that and looked into that since I never knew much about the Ensoniq series of samplers. And yeah, I went down a rabbit hole in the last weeks and looked into these old formats. They are now fully supported in ConvertWithMoss, but only for reading as I do with those old formats, because it makes not really much sense to implement some writing for these formats. And we would need to understand much more about these formats to be able to write them. And I thought, why not start out with the Mirage, since this was one of the first samplers on the market, at least the first one who was really affordable to the wider public. It was introduced in 1984 and it was an 8-bit digital sampler, and it supported 8-voice polyphony and a horrible 2-digit LED display. So you had to select the parameter with this 2-digit display, and then you could modify it. And especially for example, for setting the loop points, you had to enter hexadecimal data code. So how horrible can it be? So better times now. And it had, yeah, a whopping 128 kilobyte of memory, and there were 3 versions, 2 keyboard versions and a rack mount. What is quite surprising and which confused me quite a bit when looking into that is that it had an open architecture. They treated it more like a computer, and there were actually some alternative operating systems for it, and especially there was one by Ensoniq themselves. So if you wanted to do the sampling, you could load up a different OS which had sampling features, and you could then load up the normal one for playing. So pretty tricky thing to do. Nevertheless, some of these alternative operating systems also had different formats, and they are not supported. For example, there is one by Triton Sound Process. If someone knows about these things, just get in touch or send me some info and I could look into that as well. Yeah, and I thought, as I said, let's start with the Mirage. It must be a simple thing, but it turns out this is really a complex piece to look into. The disk format is, as expected, pretty proprietary, and it contains always 3 sounds. They can have a lower and an upper layer, and each of these layers can have up to 8 samples. And to make this more confusing, you could have 4 programs for each of these layers, which could change somehow the settings. And if you select different programs, you could get up to 16 basically different sounds with one such preset or patch, or however you want to call it. And yeah, this gets very confusing. So I decided to keep that a little bit lower, and I decided to only write out the same programs. So program 1 with program 1 from the 2 layers, and program 2 with program 2 from the 2 layers, and so on. So you will get 4 different sounds out of one such instrument preset. So, but let's check that out. So you have here on the left now the Mirage entry, and if you hover over it, you will see there are 3 different file formats. So again, you have these different disk formats, how to store the such disk on your PC or Mac, and we already had to deal with HFE for the Akai sampler, so you should know about these. IMG is basically the same without any information about the disk, so it's pretty raw data. And EDM is basically the direct instrument code. So all 3 of these formats can be used with ConvertWithMoss, and I selected here some with the EDM ending, and let's do the conversion. And there are quite some of these sounds. Another drawback of that format is that there are absolutely no names at all. So there is no naming for the presets or the instrument sounds in the preset data. Okay, where would have been shown with the 2-digit display. But also sadly, the file names don't have any meaningful names. So it's pretty hard to get some meaningful naming out of that. And yeah, so we somehow need to deal with that as well. Nevertheless, there's some cool stuff in those factory sounds, for example, and you will get these outputs. And as you see, you have these 4 different program types for each of the sounds. Yeah, let's give one a listen. So I also loaded up Bitwig, and we can load here. I chose SFZ as a destination. We can simply load that up. It loads up the ranges. And that's a nice drum kit. How much 80s can it get? Where's the hi-hat? Here it is. Nice, I love it. But let's move on to the next one, the samplers that came up after the first Mirage series. The next one were the EPS, closely followed by the EPS16 Plus, which introduced stereo sound as well as effects. And finally, there was the ASR-10 sampler, which improved some features there overall and made it nicer to use and such things. So, and in contrast to this 8-bit model, they were now proper 16-bit models, and they were basically also intended as a workstation. So it had also a sequencer on board, so you could also save songs, and you could save configurations of 8 instruments. So to create a song with 8 tracks, basically, and for each track you could load in instruments. But these things are not supported in ConvertWithMoss. What I support is the instrument category. But besides that, they had a quite powerful synth engine in there. So you had crazy 5-stage envelopes with lots of features. You also had release triggers already on board and 2 filters. And the file format is luckily pretty identical between the models. And you can also load all of the different versions on all of the model because they are basically identical. The difference is that additional parameters which got introduced in the newer models were simply stored in reserved areas, so that's a pretty nice thing to do. So you can also load these sounds on the older models. And yeah, the construct is like that. So an instrument can have up to 8 layers, and the layers in total can have 127 mono samples. And to do stereo, you had to use 2 mono samples. So this reduced it to 64 if you would use stereo. And they also had patches again, so similar like the programs they had on the Mirage. You could have now 4 patches for each instrument, which means you could activate these 8 layers differently. For example, you could have a piano on one layer and on the other layer a string sound. And then with the first program, you could activate only the piano. On the second, you could activate only the strings. And with the third, you could play both, for example. And what I do to get the data out of this is that I create all these 4 programs, but only if they are different. So if they're identical to the first one, I check for that, and then only one is created. But I do not check all the parameters. So I only check for the activated layer. So it can be that they even sound the same, even with different layers. That's some cases, but then simply deletes the duplicates. So let's give that a listen as well, or a conversion first. So we have here much more different disk versions. So we already know about HFE, but there's now also EDENGKH formats. They basically are the same as raw data with an additional information block in the beginning of the file, which contains a description what's actually contained in this file. Besides the EDE, there's also an EDA, which is basically the same thing, but it's intended for ASR, but it's basically the same format. I've also found some ISO files, which is basically a normal IBM fat disk, which contains different instrument files. And last but not least, there's also another format. Where is it located? So this EFE format contains basically only one file. So it can contain a bank file, a song file, or an instrument file. And if you try to convert a song file, for example, you will get just a warning that it's not an instrument file. So All of these different formats are supported if you select here the EPS ASR settings. So if you hover over it, you will also see all of these different file formats which can be searched and transformed. So let's finally pick something and let's do that. So let's simply go EPS and what's in there. So let's first clean the output folder. So let's convert these also to SFZ. There's not so much in it, but nevertheless should do the job for our test. And let's again go to Bitwig and let's load up one of the sounds, whatever that is. So what do we have here? Oh, nice. Quite experimental. What else do we have? Or what is this D50 thing? Ah, nice. But we could also load it in Fits, which also uses all the parameters because Bitwig is only using the basic structure of an SFZ. So let's try to load it in Fits and let's hear it here. Ah, sounds a bit different. Yeah, so that's working nicely. And yeah, please don't ask for more formats. But don't worry, there will be new ones coming as well. But so far, have lots of fun with Ensoniq formats. Enjoy, dig it, and until next time, make some funky music.